Throughout history, there has been artists in the front lines, what we now know as combat artists. And what's unique about this is there wasn't photography and videography, so they would actually just send the artist out to depict what was going on so that the civilian population could better understand a visual of what their military members were doing. So combat art in the Marine Corps has been around since 1942. For me personally, I was a sophomore in art school, and for about 10 minutes there was a history of illustration class where they talked about combat art, and I was like, what the heck, combat art? I've never heard of this before. This is all new to me. So I ran home and started researching a little bit about this, and I stumbled across artists like Chris Battles, Mike Fay, Charlie Grow, all these artists that were depicting Iraq and Afghanistan. This was the year 2010. And so I started cold calling them and asking them how I could get involved with this combat artist program. Because prior to this, I thought I was just going to be a concept artist or a storyboard artist in the movie industry. So this class really changed my life trajectory. So when I graduated art school in 2012, I joined the Marine Corps with the goal of being a Marine first and an artist second. Fast forward 6 or so years, I continued drawing in my free time and trying to do what I thought combat artists did, till eventually I got invited into the program myself and became a part of the combat artist program officially. And from there, I did a few deployments to Iraq, Baghdad, Kuwait. I did a MU deployment, which is where you deploy on a Navy ship all the time with a sketchbook, drawing and depicting Marines, not just in the front lines, but in garrison, in training, in the lulls in the fight, and trying to visualize and sketch what was going on.
Back in the 70s and into the early 80s, before my first wife died, I was doing courtroom work. So I did have that opportunity to do that visual documentation. And who was one of my biggest influences was Howard Brody, who was one of the great combat artists in World War II, Korea, even in Vietnam, Brody. And once I got to know him at the Hinckley trial, we became great friends there. And I realized that in the back of my mind, this is something I wanted to do. And then life has its own curveballs, and you go a couple decades without pursuing that. Our younger son was a Marine, and he was. We went down to Paris in 2002 to see the graduation, and that also was a trigger for me too, because in part, Vietnam War, I was a low number the last year of the draft, waiting to be called, and then they stopped the draft. Never went in. There are a lot of reasons why. One of them being seeing so many friends and neighbors come back not in good shape from the experience, and that didn't feel like a very compelling reason to go into the military, to volunteer services. So years later, 9/11, son's going into the Corps, and I'm feeling like there's something I can do here, and everything's all fitting into place. 2006, there was a Sleeping Bear had a book for military families, sort of like explaining an ABC book for the kids, what mom and dad are doing. And we did that. H is for honor. There were a couple of illustrations in that related to the Air Force. Now we go to the Society of Illustrators, of which I'm a member. Chairman of the Government Services Committee, John Witt, said to me, you know, you got a couple of drawings there. If you contributed them to the Air Force, you can get in, you know, that'll be a great in for you to be part of the program and go on missions. So I said, this sounds interesting. And I did so. And so I wound up going on a lot of missions for the Air Force where I was drawing training exercises out in the west or the south, the combat control units. That was really the hook for me. And then what I wanted to do was get into it even more. I mean, not just be there for like a few days, but try to embed. And that in its own way and through a number of wonderful coincidences, things gelled together, and I found myself in 2011 in Afghanistan with the 152nd Arctic Thunder dust-off unit. Dust-offs are the helicopters come in and pick up the wounded. And I spent a few weeks with them.
So there was a moment in my first deployment where I deployed on a Navy vessel, and this is when I was integrated with an infantry platoon to document their journey and what they were doing. So it was just me and like 300 guys, and I at this point covered them for about 7 months in training before our deployment so that they could get used to me, so that if we were in any situation that I could seamlessly work with them through the scenarios. And then 2 days into our deployment, we had gotten on our Osprey to do just one last little training op over the coast of Hawaii before we went into the Pacific. And for some reason on that day, they had moved me back an Osprey, and I still don't know why they did that. But the group of guys that I normally went with, I didn't go with in this particular moment. And on that day, that was when that Osprey actually crashed, and we lost 2 Marines, and about 22 Marines were seriously injured. So for me, it was like a big moment where I realized, wow, like my art and everything I'm doing is actually like very important to remembering like who these individuals are, and I can actually give these images to the family and friends. Some their very last moments, and then also, you know, it gained me an even tighter bond with these individuals, and for the rest of the deployment, I was able to share their stories a lot easier because I was there with them during all of this. So in the age of photography and videography, you often think, why art? And I like to describe it like this. Why would you want to limit on how you share a story? There's something to be said as to why we still have museums today and books, even if they are digitally read, as well as videos, photos. Like, it's all different elements of sharing these stories. So having artists on the front lines or in training is the same exact idea. For us, we're able to go into these situations. One, we're in uniform, so I am a Marine, and I can know how to not be a liability in these situations and be able to mesh with whatever patrol I'm on or training operation so that I'm not getting in the way, as well as being able to sketch and draw. And so I think a lot of people who look at this from an outside perspective don't understand that, but everyone that I've been around in my military career have fully appreciated having artists out there.
I think the reason civilians should be aware of this art, and one of the reasons that we do this art is to kind of like bridge this gap. We are in a world now where every life seems to be lived on a cell phone, all right, on an app, on social media, where you're not really connected. Everything is so interconnected. At the same time, people are so disconnected because of technology. They can just hide behind keypads, and doing art like this personalizes something that goes way beyond just reading about it in your morning news feed online, or if you still are traditional enough to read a paper. It takes you, it brings it back home in a more tangible way. When people see the drawings or the paintings and they connect with the people who are in those paintings, this is neither pro or anti-war. This is just seeing what somebody does, you know, and seeing the impact on their lives. seeing how it's an integral part of what this country is about. There's just no way to get around it. We're just trying to tell a story. I think the best of us, when we're doing these drawings or these paintings, we're telling stories. We're telling a visual narrative of someone or a group's endeavors. What was the artist saying? And why did they capture that particular expression? Why did they capture that gesture? How does that tell the story without hitting you in the head necessarily, you know? The importance is to create a sense of understanding. The importance is to bridge a divide in a country that's incredibly divided, to help to bridge a divide through understanding, through, in a weird way, compassion and empathy for what somebody else is doing. It's very easy to be cut off and just have people or institutions boxed in to types. And I think drawings, artwork, and photography break down help to break down that barrier, because you're seeing reflections of yourself.
If you're in the Army or the Air Force, often it's not as of a tight-knit community, in the sense that the Marine Corps is the smallest branch and supposedly one of the toughest boot camps to get through. So by the end of it, you're like one of the few and one of the proud. You're a Marine, and so you're already part of that community. Plus, being a female in the Marine Corps puts me in an even smaller bracket of female Marines who are serving alongside our male counterparts. But then when you add art on top of that, now you're trying to be part of this even smaller community of Marine Corps artists. And there's only been just over 300 or so of us since 1942. And then if you take away the civilian side of it, it's even fewer in uniform who are sharing the story of Marines. So for me, when I joined the combat art program, I was the only enlisted artist at the time. And we had one officer as well in uniform as part of the combat artist program. But it's a very, very small group. I think when I realized this, the small community, is when I was actually in boot camp and I had gotten injured. I hurt my hand, ironically. And I ended up going from a 3-month boot camp to a 7-month boot camp. And while I was there recovering, one of the artists who Mike Fay, who was a combat artist in Iraq, reached out to was Victor Juhasz. While
she was recouping, I sent a print to her, in which, you know, when they saw it at the hospital, it was like, oh, who's this? Who's, you know, well, look at this piece of art coming in for you, you know, blah, blah, blah. But we were encouraging her. And in that moment, I hadn't even met him yet, and I was like, oh wow, this is a really tight-knit group of individuals, and the fact that he would send this to me when I'm not even technically part of anything yet speaks volumes. She was raw back then. She was really raw. And to see what she's been growing into has been incredible. She's really been so dedicated to doing the best she can. She takes a little bit from people like me. She takes a little bit from people like Richard Johnson, from I'm sure Chris Battles and Mike Fay. She's just bouncing off. And once and especially since she left the Corps, and just as she's been practicing like furiously. It's been awesome and humbling to see how hard she works. So she's got a really good future in terms of not just doing combat art, but just doing any kind of art. She's really good.